We turn now to some song close-ups. This is the chance I have to really try to convince you that some of this stuff from their Satanic Majesty's sessions are really very interesting in a lot of kinds of ways and maybe surprising ways. The songs we'll deal with in this video are going to be We Love You, Dandelion, which even though they aren't on that album, are from that same general recording period. In Another Land, The Lantern, She's a Rainbow, and 2,000 Light Years from Home. So let's dig in with the song We Love You. Released in the US in September of 1967, a month earlier in August of 1967 in the UK, going to number 8 in the UK. It was actually the B-side, Dandelion, which we'll talk about next, which was the hit in the United States, going to number 14. Was recorded at Olympic as all of these tracks in June and July of '67, supposedly produced by Andrew Oldham, but that was only because this was released before the official break had been signed, so there was probably some contractual requirement that Andrew's name be on the label. Engineered by Glenn Johns, features Nicky Hopkins on piano, and interestingly, John Lennon and Paul McCartney on backup vocals. And that's because Mick and Marianne Faithfull, and I think Brian Jones, had been present at the All You Need Is Love international worldwide telecast in the summer of '67. So this was all done sort of at about the same time. And it was also partly, as the story goes, a way for John and Paul to show solidarity with the Rolling Stones during this time when they were being prosecuted and probably persecuted by authorities. When we look at the song We Love You, it's an AABA form, so that part of it is very familiar to us. It opens with an intro. First of all, it opens with a prison door slamming, and then you get this Nicky Hopkins piano lick. The story Nicky tells is that he'd actually had that piano lick hanging around for a while and had been doing various sessions and was trying to find a way of working it into something he'd been called to play on, and this was that session. So he got to get his pet lick into this tune, and it becomes kind of like the lick that holds the thing together, sort of like the guitar lick and I Can't Get No Satisfaction holds that one together. Well, you get an A verse, a bridge that again returns to Nicky's piano lick. You get some more of the sort of prison door, sort of chains kind of thing. You know, obviously they're referring to the fact that they've been on trial and this kind of thing. They come back with a verse and then a kind of an extended coda. This idea of extending the coda and just not just sort of fading out right away like you would for a regular AM track, but kind of leaving some more stuff on at the end. That's going to become increasingly important in Stones music, including their singles. The sound effects, as I've already said, refer to the drug trial. There's a video done by an artist named Peter Whitehead that accompanies the song. And in the video has got a judge up there, a judge in a courtroom, and has got Mick Jagger sort of standing in the docket there, you know. And there's even a point where they've got, I think it's Marianne Faithfull or a model who's supposed to look like her laying across the witness chair with nothing on but a rug, you know. And so they're basically, the whole song is sort of referring to this experience. And what the lyrics express is not anger or resentment about the experience, but a kind of hippie love for the establishment in the wake of this persecution. So the perfect kind of hippie response to somebody else's negative vibes is just not to absorb the negative vibes, but reflect them with positive energy. And so this is essentially kind of what the song does, saying we love you. And it may as well say we love you in spite of the lousy way you're treating us, but it doesn't say that. It doesn't go there. It continues, it sort of stays sort of on the positive vibe. Now, the extended ending of this track has a kind of menacing quality. In fact, the kind of menacing quality musically that you hear in I Am a Walrus with the Beatles from Magical Mystery Tour, except this track is recorded and done before I Am a Walrus. And I just love these details during a period where everybody thinks the Rolling Stones are imitating the Beatles when they're actually doing things the Beatles do after them, probably after hearing their music, having been in the studio, heard the playback because they were singing on those tracks, you see. So it's not that the Stones were always imitating the Beatles. There were plenty of times, I think, when the Beatles were influenced very much by the Rolling Stones. The collage effect at the end, there's a bunch of things sort of coming and going from the audio soundscape, reminds us a lot of the end of All You Need Is Love, which has got a lot of collage kind of ending. Well, let's turn to the B side now, the side that was the A side in the US, because that's the one people here, DJs seem to prefer. Dandelion is the name of it, just like we said before, released in September here in the US, in August in the UK, a number 14 hit, recorded at Olympic in the fall of 1966. So that was during the Between the Buttons. So this is actually one of the earliest of the tracks that we're talking about, sort of pre their Satanic Majesties sessions, which don't start until February '67. So at the very end, when they were finishing up Between the Buttons, they get to work on this one, Dandelion. Don't finish it and come back to it during the summer of 1967 to finish it. As I listen to the lyrics, I think Lennon and McCartney are probably singing on this one too. They're only given credit for singing on We Love You, but it sure sounds like them on this one as well. I think this song is the strongest Beach Boys influenced Rolling Stones track you can find. It screams Pet Sounds to me in terms of the way it sounds. There's a very prominent harpsichord, all of those vocals, the whole kind of vibe of the whole thing is very Beach Boys to me. The form is fairly typical. It's an AABA form with a partial reprise, so we get a verse, a bridge, a verse. That's our AABA form, and then the partial reprise of the bridge and the verse, and then a coda with a spacey kind of orchestral ending on this one. The lyrics seem to refer to the innocence of lost youth. When you get tied up by the pressures and responsibilities of adult life, remember how the dandelion simply floats on the air, going wherever the breeze takes it with seeming lack of concern. Very sort of another kind of hippie message, which is, there's also, as I understand it, a British kind of children's game where they use the dandelion heads to sort of mark the face of a clock or something like that. But I think that may be where the idea starts, but the idea of when you feel all tied up and tense and all that kind of thing, just blowing on the dandelion and the little seeds sort of taking off in the air and being so graceful and going wherever they go without a sense of anxiety about where they need to be. That's what Dandelion is. It's almost like a praise for the return of childlike innocence and the kind of wisdom and perception that can come with that. Again, very hippie-like. I would say that when we think about the way this song relates to other Rolling Stones tunes, it's certainly similar to Ruby Tuesday, which is about a kind of a free-spirited woman. And this song also received a video by Peter Whitehead, as We Love You did. We turn now to a Bill Wyman song, one of the very few Bill Wyman songs that the Rolling Stones ever recorded. This one, called In Another Land, came out, as I said before, strangely in early December of '67, only to be replaced by She's a Rainbow. And a couple weeks later. Anyway, it did make it to number 87 on the US charts. It was released in the US only. But the funny thing about this song is it was almost recorded, well, I wouldn't say it was recorded by mistake, but the session started in February. And it was one of those nights where people were supposed to show up at the studio, and Mick and Keith didn't show up. Maybe something was happening with legal things, or they had to be somewhere else, but the time was booked. Glyn Johns was sitting there, and he said, well, you guys have got the time booked. Is there anything you'd like to record? Bill says, I got something. And so they do this song, In Another Land, and Mick and Keith come in at a later point and hear the song, and they say, yeah, that could work on the record. So they decide to include it on the record. So it was finished in the summer of 1967 as they were working on other tracks from the Satanic Majesties record. The form is a fairly traditional contrasting verse-chorus. It starts with an intro, then you get a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, a verse, a chorus, and then a little coda, and then it ends with the sound of snoring, which in the prankster world of Mick and Keith was happened one night when Bill Wyman fell asleep in the sound in the mixing room, and they got a microphone and thought they would record it, and then they put it on the end of his song. Well, it turns out it was kind of a good thing to put on the end of the song, because the lyrics really are about dreams. The verse sort of describes a fantastic land in a dream, and then the chorus is about waking up from that dream. Everybody's had that experience where they've been having a fantastic dream, and they wake up and they're angry that they woke up because they want to go back to the dream. Well, that's kind of what this song does. And in the dream, the images that it talks about are very similar to the kind of images that we see in something like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. But again, this song was recorded before Sgt. Pepper was released. And so it's just a kind of a parallel kind of thing, in the same way that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and White Rabbit by the Jefferson Airplane both use some of the same kinds of imagery. But anyway, there's certainly a kinship there. Lead vocal by Bill Wyman in the verses is treated with a kind of a tremolo effect that kind of makes the voice shaky like that. The keyboard instrument, if you're wondering what that keyboard instrument is that accompanies some of it, the verses that is, I think is a harpsichord with the string mute applied. It's possible to put a mute on the strings so that they sound, so that they don't sustain in any kind of way and they just go pluck, 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 pluck like that. And that's what we're hearing there. So interesting for us in the sense that it's a Bill Wyman song using sort of very flowery, psychedelic kinds of lyrics and studio effects to create that kind of tremolo effect. Well, we turn now to the song that is the B-side on that record, and that's a song called The Lantern. Now, I wouldn't normally draw your attention to The Lantern. It really is a B-side or an album track, if there ever was one. It was released again as the B-side on this, The Other Land is a single, but appears on the record. Recorded in July and August of 1967. A simple verse form, so you've got an intro, a verse, then you have a kind of interlude, which has a brass and an organ and a kind of classical reference, and there's a verse, the interlude comes back again, and a verse. What's interesting about the song, and the reason why I bring it to your attention, is the lyrics deal with death. And the way the story in the song goes is, whichever person in this conversation that happens in the song should die first will send back some indication from the other side. So the images are all about one person, being on one side, one person being on the death side, and one person being on the life side, and all the kind of things that come from that situation. And I just wonder, as we look forward to something like Sympathy for the Devil, this idea of sort of more kind of really broadly philosophical kind of what if, imagine this kind of song, thought experiment kind of thing. If this really isn't sort of on the way towards something like Sympathy for the Devil. So I ask you to give that one a fresh listen and see if you can hear some of that going on. We move on now to She's a Rainbow, which is the song that was released just a couple weeks after In Another Land, She's a Rainbow, again, also from December. Number 25 on the charts here on the US only. These aren't particularly good chart numbers, but remember, it's starting to be about the album now, and the album did very, very well. Singles, maybe not as important at this particular moment. This particular song, She's a Rainbow, recorded in May and June of 1967. The form is a kind of modified contrasting verse-chorus form. I think this is very, very interesting. When the song starts out, you think you're hearing a piano introduction, playing a melody. It sort of sounds very sort of classical. And then the singing comes in, and that seems like it might be a verse or a chorus, you don't really know. And then you get another verse. Well, the intro, I guess to back up a minute, what seems like an intro is actually a verse. The thing you don't know is that there are lyrics that go with that melody. You just haven't heard them yet. It hasn't been sung yet. So you get a played verse, played instrumentally, that sounds like an intro. Then you get what turns out to be the chorus when the vocals come in. Then you get another verse, which is again played instrumentally. So how are you supposed to know it's a verse? It just sounds like an instrumental interlude. And then that same chorus comes back again with the vocals. And then the verse is played instrumentally again with the piano solo. So again, it seems like you're just getting a chorus with this instrumental interlude that's pretty much the same each time. And then when the chorus comes back this third time, it's instrumental. It sounds like it's a bit more sort of ornamented on the piano. There are some strings that come in. And then it's almost like the song starts again. And now what was the piano playing the melody has now got singing along with it and a verse that takes that melody for the very first time. So you get a sung verse, a sung chorus, then another sung verse, then another sung chorus. Then it goes back to the original routine where the verse is done instrumentally by the piano, and then the chorus is done instrumentally at first, and the vocal center. So you really only have two sections. It seems like they're just instrumental interludes, but it turns out they're verses. Anyway, to a guy who analyzes a lot of popular music, I've never seen one really quite like this one before, so it's very interesting from that point of view. Shows some experimentation, and not only that, but also all the classical references that go with it. The lyrics describe a beautiful woman dressed in colorful clothing, and I wonder, is this another portrait of Ruby Tuesday, aka Marianne Faithfull? The classical references are very strong, and remember, we tracked those classical references in Ruby Tuesday back to As Tears Go By, the first one that used strings, and so now we get this other one with all this classical stuff going on. Seems to be about the same woman that was in Ruby Tuesday. This time it's about how beautiful she is in her colored clothing and the sunlight and all this kind of thing like that. And so it seems to be another kind of classical music meets Marianne Faithfull in a Rolling Stones song. Interestingly, the string arrangement here done by John Paul Jones, who at that time was kind of a studio arranger, keyboard, bass guy around London. Later, of course, to become the bass player in Led Zeppelin. The loose ending we get at the very end of this tune is very reminiscent of Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby? The song doesn't really end as much as it kind of falls apart in a certain kind of way on purpose. They could have faded it out. They left it that way. Tomorrow Never Knows on Revolver kind of ends the same way. It just kind of falls apart. And actually, the ends of most of those songs that have fade out sound that way in the studio during mix time. They fade them out before you're able to hear that. They just decide to leave that sort of ragged tail hanging there. And so that sounds an awful lot like what happens in Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby as well. Well, the last one I want to spend a little bit of time on here is 2,000 Light Years from Home. This one, another sort of real favorite of mine. The B-side, again, to She's a Rainbow, recorded initially in February, then July, August, September '67, so it means the Stones came back to this tune again and again as they were working on it. The tune itself is a simple verse song. It starts with a strange kind of intro, which has some sort of atonal kind of modern piano sounds, tape effects. Then this bass guitar comes in with this sort of spooky low sort of spooky spy lick, and this eerie mellotron starts to come in. The mellotron is that keyboard that has recorded orchestra sounds on it, and you trigger them with an actual keyboard, kind of like the original sampler. Instead of everything being digital, they were actually on little tapes that were inside the keyboard. But it sounds really, really strange. That's because the lyrics deal with space travel. Well, there aren't that many songs that really dealt with space travel in a kind of serious and not cartoonish kind of way. And this one talks about space travel as the spacecraft gets farther and farther out in space, 100 light years from home, 600 light years from home, 1,000 light years from home, 2,000 light years from home. So as the song goes through, you get the verse with the refrain, and you notice the sort of 60s pop organ. You get a couple of verses like that, then it sort of seems to stop, and the song starts all over again, reintroduces the introduction. I call that the re-intro. You get another verse, and then you get a coda filled with all kinds of spacey sounds, echoey sounds, that eerie mellotron, just really, really sort of unsettling kind of music. And again, when we think about these kinds of things, you know, songs about space, we think of David Bowie and Space Oddity, but that's all after this. You know, I Am the Walrus, Green Glass Onion, that's all after this. I mean, the only thing that really sort of comes before this that's maybe kind of interesting is some of the records that Joe Meek, the producer in the early 1960s, was doing some of his sort of space records. And he actually had a hit with a song that was roughly kind of a space song called Telstar. But maybe that's the influence here, or maybe the movies, the soundtracks they were hearing in sort of space movies was the space and science fiction movies was the kind of thing that influenced them. But again, here's a case of the Rolling Stones, a song that's not really thought of a lot as being a kind of a classic Stones track. It's really being very much ahead of the curve of what a lot of other people, I mean, think of progressive rock in the early 70s and how wedded that is to themes of space and special mellotron sounds and all kinds of sort of sound effects and this kind of thing. Well, the Stones are there. Here they're doing this, starting this up in February of 1967. So they're there at the very beginning of all this, and I think it's certainly worth worth thinking about. So, look, we've looked at a bunch of songs now from the period around their Satanic Majesty's request, and the argument I want to make is there's an awful lot of very interesting experimentation going on here. Of course, they won't keep up with this this level of experimentation. They're going to refine it down, take just like one does with experimentation, take the best parts, the most useful parts, and turn them into a real synthesis, and we'll see that in Beggar's Banquet. But before we get to Beggar's Banquet, let's have a look at the year 1968 in review as we leave 67 and move in to 1968.